Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
I come here tonight and plead with you. Believe in yourself and believe that you're somebody. Nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Kennysonian or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can do this for us. If the Negro is to be free, he must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with the pen and ink of self-assertive manhood his own emancipation proclamation.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, January 13th, 2024. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka, bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, we're going to hear a special message from our own treasure trove of wisdom, the walking library, the Sultan of Study, Dr. Gerald Horne. That'll be followed by yet another special message, this time from Prison Radio, as we hear from Brother Darren Stanley, aka Knowledge Born God Allah, with an update on his situation as he exits death row. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Willard Jenkins, artistic director of the DC Jazz Festival and editor of the book Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story, right here on Freedom Now. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure that your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Motown's Funk Brothers and Marvin Gaye, Pora Jazz, Dizzy Gillespie, Arturo O'Farrell, Wayne Shorter, and Duke Pearson. Now people, get ready for this train to coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a special message from Dr. Gerald Horne.
Don't let anybody take your manhood. Be proud of our heritage. As somebody said earlier tonight, We don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean. But I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful.
L'impérialisme, à bas. Le colonialisme, à bas. Le néocolonialisme, à bas. Le sionisme, à bas. L'apartheid, à bas. Foster, à bas. Ian Smith, à bas. Benkin, à bas. Vive la révolution. Vive la révolution. Vive le président Sékou Touré. Vive le président Sékou Touré. Vive la révolution africaine. Vive la révolution africaine. Vive all revolutionary parties. Vive.
Ja Rastafari. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with the African Drumbeat Historical Weekly Calendar for Freedom Now. This calendar is to give life to our ancestors, our revolutionary ancestors, who have given so much to future generations of humanity in the war against the satanic system of slavery, colonialism, and capitalism. January 17th, 1961. Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo, was assassinated by President Kennedy's sanctioned CIA operation to destabilize the rise of a revolutionary Pan-Africanist party. The movement National Congolese, whose leader, Lumumba, represented the aspirations of the masses of the Congolese in the century-old struggle to throw out the Belgian slave masters. January 17th, 1979. The Shah of Iran, a U.S. CIA-installed puppet, was placed by the CIA-backed coup d'etat against Mossadegh, the democratic elected Prime Minister of Iran in 1954. The Shah's overthrow was led by a mass popular uprising which rejected the U.S. path of capitalist development. January 17, 1942. Muhammad Ali, the most militant professional athlete in the history of the United States, was born. Ali's public stance against racism, class oppression, and the U.S. imperialist wars in Vietnam and in Africa earned him adulation of the masses of oppressed people throughout the world. Ali was a student of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. January 18, 1958. The Lumbee Indians defeated the Ku Klux Klan in a violent battle near Martin, North Carolina. January 20th, 1973. Amilcar Cabral, founder of the Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, was assassinated by the Portuguese, their former colonial masters, and the United States CIA. Cabral, another leading Pan-Africanist, was targeted due to his refusal to become a neo-colony of the United States and Europe. Cabral's ideological contribution on class struggle, culture, and revolution has immortalized him among all African freedom fighters worldwide. January 21st, 1924. V.I. Lenin, the leader of the first modern revolutionary socialist state in the world, dies. Leninism becomes a component aspect of Marxist ideology, which fueled revolutionary fervor throughout Europe. It stood in direct contradiction to capitalism and imperialist ideology, thereby providing the USSR with principled support for African, Asian, and Latin American decolonization movements. Whereas the United States and all capitalist countries consistently sabotage all democratic movements against colonialism in the Third World. January 22nd, 1879. The Zulu Empire defeats the British invaders at the Battle of Isandlwana in South Africa, one of the many victories in the war for Mother Africa. January 22nd, 1800. Nat Turner, upon receiving the word from God, leads African slave rebellions against the Europeans in American plantation slavetocracy. January 22nd, 1937. Tamara Bangdi, codenamed Tania, was born in Argentina. She joined the Cuban Revolution and became one of Che Guevara's top military commanders. This has been our African Drumbeat historical calendar for Freedom Now 90.7 in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and you can contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. For a listing of prior programs and content, please go to kpfk.org, then to programs, scroll down to Freedom Now. We would like to close this section of our program with a unity chant from Azania, South Africa. So please join us. We will say Amandla, which means power, and your response should be Awetu, which means it is ours.
Amandla.
Awetu.
Amandla.
Awetu.
Amandla.
Awetu.
We with the Freedom Now family regret to inform you that Sekou Odinga has joined the ancestors this week. Born June 17, 1944, Odinga was inspired by Malcolm X to join the Organization for Afro-American Unity, and following his assassination would eventually join the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. He played a key role in the liberation of Assata Shakur and served 33 years behind bars as a result. This is a legendary figure in our struggle for liberation, and while he will be missed, he will be far from forgotten. We send peace and blessings to his family, and we thank him for all of his service to the people. Rest in power, Baba Sekou Odinga.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. Please visit kpfk.org or my Facebook page and get details of my book signing in Africatown, Leimert Park on February 3rd, 2024 from 1 to 3 p.m. This is a benefit for KPFK with all proceeds going to your favorite radio station. The books to be launched at this important event not only include my latest, speaking of acknowledging radical histories, and I dare say a Gerald Horne reader, but also available for inspection and inscription will be my books on Paul Robeson and jazz and boxing and Southern Africa and Cuba and Haiti. But I will also provide a detailed sneak preview of my next book to be published this summer, entitled Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black nationalists and liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. First and foremost, this is a book about the Southland. For example, in discussing the Panthers, my focus is on those with roots in Pasadena, speaking of Eldridge Cleaver, George Jackson, and his younger brother, Jonathan Jackson. Recall that it was Jonathan Jackson, then a teenager, who got involved in a shootout in Northern California, apparently in an abortive attempt to free his imprisoned older brother, George Jackson. This was in August 1970. While a high schooler in Pasadena, Jonathan Jackson was quite precocious, publishing an extraordinary student newspaper entitled Iskra, which took its name directly from V.I. Lenin. His older brother, George Jackson, was an extraordinary revolutionary slain under still mysterious conditions in August 1971, which in turn inspired prisoner revolts nationally, not least in Attica in upstate New York. His books, Soledad Brother and Blood in My Eye, are still worth perusal. Eldridge Cleaver, also with roots in Pasadena, executed what was one of the boldest initiatives in the history of Black America, when he and his comrades established an international office for the Black Panther Party in Algeria, then sought solidarity with our struggle here in Congo, Brazzaville. Indeed, one of the many lessons of my book is that our movement needs to follow up on the Panthers' attempt to internationalize our struggle. My book, to be published this summer, for which I will be providing a sneak preview on February 3rd, also sheds light on still controversial events, including the slaying on UCLA's campus of Panther leaders Bunchy Carter and John Huggins in January 1969. It also provides new details on the shootout between the LAPD and the Panthers in December 1969, which led to a trial of Panther leaders where they were able to escape the most severe punishments, not least because of the expert lawyering of the late Leo Branton. Leo Branton is one of the leading figures in this book. Of African and indigenous ancestry, he was descended from the Choctaw leader Greenwood LaFleur. He was a mentor of the late Johnny Cochran. Recall that it was Cochran who defended footballer O.J. Simpson successfully 3 decades ago. Branton also was the chief lawyer for Angela Davis, who was acquitted as a result of the action taken by the aforementioned Jonathan Jackson. This after coming under fire, speaking of Davis, at UCLA because of her admitted membership in the Communist Party. Leo Branton was also the attorney in the 1951-1952 trial of the leadership of the Communist Party in Los Angeles. In fact, my book seeks to reframe the historiography of the Panthers by portraying them as a kind of halfway house between socialist movements, not unlike those of Cuba and Southern Africa, and the indigenous Black nationalism that arose in the wake of the assassination of Malcolm X. Thus, the chief counsel for the Panthers, Charles Gary of San Francisco, emerged from the radical left-wing movements of the San Francisco Bay Area. Leo Branton's defense of the Communist Party was not as successful as his defense of Angela Davis and the Panthers. Indeed, the conviction of the CP leadership, not only in Los Angeles but nationally, continues to resonate even today. What I mean is that the CP leadership in the Southland was heavily Jewish, and months after their conviction, there was a turning point when the Jewish communists, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were executed, subjected to the death penalty for supposedly leaking a non-existent secret of atomic weaponry to the then Soviet Union. This was a subtle message to Jewish communists convincing some that the better part of wisdom was to ditch the struggle for socialism and labor rights in favor of liberalism. Not coincidentally, labor militancy, which seemed to be flourishing in Los Angeles. See my earlier book, Class Struggle in Hollywood, for an example of what I'm speaking of. This labor militancy began to decline, only beginning to revive in 2023 with the Hollywood strike, the UPS strike, the strike of auto workers, to name a few. Moreover, with the wounding of Jewish communists, the stage was set for the ascendancy of Jewish nationalism, now on view not only in historic Palestine today, but also in the increasingly hysterical efforts to suppress criticism of Israel, including the sacking of Harvard University's first black president, Claudine Gay, the daughter of Haitian immigrants, not least because she was deemed to be insufficiently enthusiastic in supporting the genocidal campaign now being conducted in Gaza by Israeli war criminals. My book's sneak preview on February 3rd also draws heavily upon Southland resources. For example, Cal State Fullerton has some of the strongest sources on the right wing nationally and in Southern California. Cal State LA has the archive of the late former leading black politician, speaking of Mervyn Dimely. UC Santa Barbara has the best material on the bombings of Bank of America branches, not least in Isla Vista, adjacent to this beachside campus. San Diego State University and UC San Diego have very good sources on the internecine conflict between the Panthers and black nationalists in the US organization. Ironically, some of the best sources on the shootout at UCLA in January 1969 are cited at Loyola Marymount. The Huntington Library in Pasadena has probably the best sources on Southland history generally. Thus, if you are interested in the history of Orange County or Santa Barbara or LA or Pasadena, run, don't walk, to our fundraiser for KPFK FM on February 3rd from 1 to 3. This book also has the most comprehensive account to be published thus far of the Southland NAACP, in existence now for more than a century. The story is told through the organization's massive archive, cited at the Library of Congress, and told in part through the lives of longtime leader Dr. H. Claude Hudson and his son, Elbert Hudson, who served on the LA Police Commission. Speaking of the latter, this book also presents a comprehensive analysis of the LAPD, whose depredations against Black LA helped to make the LA chapter of the Panthers the second to be organized after that in Oakland. Their depredations, as my previous book on LA demonstrated, gave rise to the Watts Revolt of 1965 and its counterpart in LA circa 1992. It also led directly to measures towards armed self-defense, which are detailed at length in this book. Back to the NAACP, its Beverly Hills Hollywood chapter was a chief fundraiser for the national organization. It focused heavily in increasing Black participation in Hollywood, which set the stage for the ascendancy of Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish and Steve Harvey, Eddie Murphy, and Will Smith and Samuel L. Jackson. Indeed, the recent interview with comic Cat Williams would have benefited tremendously from this kind of historical perspective. For the fact is that both Panthers and communists received substantial support from Hollywood. At a fraught moment in the Angela Davis case, for example, the talented screenwriter Dalton Trumbo provided a rationale used successfully by her attorney, Leo Branton. Singers like Aretha Franklin and Nina Simone were both supporters of Professor Davis. Amongst Panther supporters were Ossie Davis and Marlon Brando and Jane Fonda and Gene Seberg. Of course, in this book, I will also deal with errors. For example, Panthers likely did not know that some communists had been trained in Moscow in the 1930s in the art of guerrilla warfare. Panthers likewise should have paid more attention to their relations with Cuba. They also did not recognize the important distinctions between armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. And at a time in the 1970s, when US imperialism was working out an accord with China against the Soviet Union, Panthers were convinced that it was Moscow and Washington that were collaborating against China. This led to disastrous results, particularly in the Panthers' relationship with socialist Cuba. In addition to a sneak preview of this book on Southern California, there will be other books available for you to pick up, with all proceeds going to your favorite radio station, KPFK. Therefore, be there or be square. February 3rd, 1 to 3, Africatown, Leimert Park. Check kpfk.org for details or check my Facebook page for details. For KPFK, Los Angeles, Pacifica Radio, this has been Gerald Horne.
Peace, this knowledge-born got a lot calling from Solano State Prison. You know, I let my viewers know, I let all y'all know that I'm off death row. I've been resentenced, and I'm still in court, so I'm still going to the federal courts, which the federal judge, Edward Chin, said he's going to reverse my case completely, which I should be at home within a few, maybe 6, 7, 8 months. Also, I filed a Racial Injustice Act for all, and that should be heard to vacate my whole sentence. So I wasn't supposed to be on death row for no 33 years, let alone in prison. Yet I'm on my way home now. I'm sitting in Solano Prison on my way to Oakland, California home. But at the same time, I want my viewers to know that I love y'all and I appreciate y'all, and I will continue to run my podcast and have my podcast, and guest speakers can call in. You know, you can connect with me online. You know, we can connect any kind of way you want. Also, I'm building a 5% Nation of God's and Earth program here in Solano, along with the Office of Cultural Management, which is Allow You Justice, Divine Prince. I'll be allowed mathematics, and our regional representative, Sean Livinochi, which is Self-Savior. And so we building the program here. So all those that's, you know what I'm saying, interested in how the program going to go, you know, get at me, you know, call the station, you know, let them know you want to get in contact with me, or contact me through the mail, or contact me GTL, or on my Instagram, my YouTube channel, Knowledge Born God of Love. You know what I mean? And, you know, y'all take care. I'm going to keep y'all updated. Right now, I got to go take care of some business. I want to make sure the other brother get his thing together. But I love y'all. You know what I'm saying? I'm alive. I'm good. I'm healthy. I'm strong. And I'll be home in a minute. You know what I mean? And so y'all take care. Keep y'all head up in the days. Mathematics is born. Today's supreme alphabet is Islam. So y'all know the business. Love y'all. Take care. Peace.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. It is now time for more historical contextual breakdowns with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined on the line by Willard Jenkins. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For Pacifica Radio KPFK, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Willard Jenkins, Artistic Director of the DC Jazz Festival and editor of the book Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Willard Jenkins.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here. Certainly it's a pleasure being here on another fellow Pacifica station.
Great. It's a pleasure to have you. So why did you do this book?
Well, I began writing about jazz as an undergraduate at Kent State University. And then after graduation, I was living in Cleveland, my hometown, where I grew up, although my hometown is Pittsburgh, but I grew up in Cleveland. And my father was a newspaper man, and he knew of my interest in writing. He had read some of the things I had written as an undergrad. And so he arranged for me to meet with the editor of the Friday magazine of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And, as you know, most major daily newspapers have a Friday entertainment supplement to cover things that are going to happen socially and artistically throughout the course of the coming weekend. And so this gentleman read some of my writing, and he hired me. He engaged me to write previews of upcoming jazz-related performances in Cleveland. And so I started writing for a daily newspaper in that regard. I was always writing for the so-called alternative weeklies and community weeklies around town. And so my writing began to really escalate to the point where I began to travel to various festivals to cover festivals, such as the old Newport, New York Jazz Festival, which eventually became the Cool Jazz Festival, which eventually became the JVC Jazz Festival, all under the aegis of a man named George Wein, who was the founder of the Newport Jazz Festival. And if you think back to the history of the Newport Jazz Festival, they had some issues with some rowdy crowds and whatnot. And basically they shut down the Newport operation for a few years and moved it all to New York. So I was going to those festivals, which were international festivals. And I was seeking press credentials, and I was granted press credentials. And invariably, in those concert settings, they would seat the media together in a certain proximity. And although I was welcomed by my fellow members of the media, and it was a very welcoming environment, I looked around and recognized the fact that there were so few, if any. I was often the only African American, the only Black writer covering this music. And, of course, that raised all kinds of questions, because this music is a product of the African experience in America. And so why was it that you'd see an array of African American or Black musicians on stage, but when it came to writing about the music, then the equation was flipped, and there were so few Black writers covering the music? So it began to raise questions in my mind, and those questions kind of escalated down through the years as I then also began to have opportunities to cover festivals overseas. And at those festivals, I would almost always be the only Black writer amongst a group of writers from around the world covering various international festivals. So that question of where are the Black writers continued to haunt me. And as I began to meet more of these writers, and it was interesting also, Gerald, because the white writers that I was meeting at these festivals, including some of the greats of the form, like Leonard Feather and Dan Morgenstern and Ira Gittler and those others, they were very welcoming. And as I look back on it, I think one of the reasons that they were very welcoming and open to me was because they recognized that here finally is someone black writing about this music. We need to embrace this man and try and encourage others. But that equation continued to bother me. And so about 10 years ago, I started a series of interviews on my website, which is openskyjazz.com. I have, I refer to it as a webzine, but I have what's in popular parlance referred to as a blog, and it's called The Independent Ear at openskyjazz.com. So I started interviewing those black writers whom I had met at various conferences and various activities. And they in turn began to introduce me to others whom I had not met previously. But, you know, I began to seek out black writers for these interviews. And at a certain point, it became clear that this could be a copy for a book. And here we have it, Ain't But a Few of Us.
To that end,
the title, I should add, Joe, the title of the book came from basically a colloquial expression. You know, one evening I was at Jazz at Lincoln, and before it was Jazz at Lincoln Center, they had a summer series that developed Jazz at Lincoln Center. And I was at one of those concerts, and I think it was a concert honoring Jackie McLean and his music. And so at intermission, I go out into the lobby like everybody else, and I'm seeing clusters of musicians and whatnot, chatting and whatnot, because Jackie was obviously a big favorite in the musicians community. So there were a lot of great musicians at this particular concert. And I recall one time vividly watching Milt Jackson approach Jimmy Heath, two of the great jazz masters approaching each other. And they embraced, and Milt Jackson said, "You know, Jimmy, there ain't but a few of us." And what he meant was there weren't but a few of them of that era, that bebop era, still alive and performing. But I took that and ran with it and said, that's interesting. Ain't but a few of us, because when it comes to writing about jazz, there ain't but a few of us in terms of black writers. And so that's where that came from.
Speaking of which, who is Amiri Baraka, and what role does he play in your book?
Well, Amiri Baraka is, of course, known for his laudatory political actions in and around Newark, New Jersey, and the world. But Amiri Baraka was also a great poet, and he was also one of the trailblazing black writers on jazz. He had a column in Downbeat magazine called Apple Cores, and he was very prominent in writing about jazz in the 1960s on up. That's where some of us first became familiar with the name. Back then it was Leroy Jones. Later he evolved to become Amiri Baraka. And so he became kind of a touchstone for so many of us black writers on jazz. And as I was interviewing the writers who appear in Ain't But a Few of Us, whose interviews appear in Ain't But a Few of Us, you know, to a man and woman, they cited Amiri Baraka as one of their great influences. And so he's someone that, unfortunately, he passed before I had an opportunity to interview him for this book. And one of the things in the book, one of the key elements in the book, besides the interviews with these writers, 22 writers, is an anthology section. And so it was absolutely essential to have Amiri Baraka in the anthology section. And the piece that he wrote that we selected for the anthology section is actually a piece that is at the core of the reason behind this book. His piece, he wrote a piece called about black critics and about white critics, and it became a touchstone for this particular book, a piece called Jazz and the White Critic, where he wrote about wondering aloud why it was that this music, which comes from the African American experience, why this music was so heavily covered in terms of the media by non-black writers and commentators. And so this piece, Jazz and the White Critic, became kind of a touchstone theme for the book as he wonders aloud why that equation is the way it is.
Can you give us a summary of why that equation is the way it is?
It's interesting, Gerald. I don't have a direct answer to that, other than to suggest that, we tend to operate in a way that when we see ourselves, it provides a certain license to act accordingly. And so I think part of it is the fact that Black writers just weren't seeing themselves in the writing and the reportage on this music. And I also think that the whole aspect of writing about jazz was never necessarily viewed by some as a career pursuit. However, I'm one who thinks that it certainly can be a starting point for a pursuit of working within this music, because I can only look at myself as an example, because I started out writing about the music, and that was how I got my foothold in working within this music that I'm so passionate about. And so, I just think that the whole aspect of writing about the music has not necessarily been something that has resonated with young Black writers coming up. And I think that the example of this book and the writers who are interviewed in this book, if exposed, I think it will hopefully create more interest and opportunities for Black writers to write about the music.
You also collaborated on the autobiography of Randy Weston, the literal and figurative giant of the keyboard, of the piano, with roots in Brooklyn and Panama, who wound up in exile in North Africa and Morocco. How did he wind up there? How did he survive? How did it impact his music? And how did you wind up collaborating with him on this wonderful book?
Well, I think it's a little bit, in terms of nomenclature, language, it's a little bit of a misnomer to consider him to have been exiled to North Africa. He wound up there by choice, because he had always had a desire to live on the African continent. His father, who was a Garveyite and a businessman in Brooklyn, who had a couple of restaurants and corner stores and whatnot, his father stressed the fact to him as a kid that he was an African living in America. And his father had various images available to young Randy as a boy, that he could see the greatness of Africa around him. And so it planted a huge seed with Randy, and he always wanted at some point to live in Africa. He wound up doing one of those State Department tours. You recall back in the late 50s and early 60s and whatnot, there were those State Department tours of Black band leaders going around various parts of the world and performing under the auspices of the United States State Department. And that was a means, as they saw it, of stemming the tide of the red tide, if you will, the tide of communism around the world. And also of expressing to the African nations that America was their friend, and here are these great Black musicians, just to exemplify African American culture and whatnot. And so he took one of those tours, and he toured a number of different countries in Africa, and that basically stoked the fire in him as far as his desire to live in Africa. And when you think about when you know about Randy Weston's evolution and the music that he expressed and his various expressions regarding Africa, naturally you would come to think that oh, well, he's going to wind up in West Africa or Central Africa or maybe even East Africa. But he wound up living in Morocco, which some folks don't think of as Black Africa, but which is indeed part of Black Africa. And he wound up in Morocco because a performance in Rabat, which is the capital of Morocco, at the end of his State Department tour, that performance was so well received by the audience that he was getting letters and whatnot from the consulate in Morocco with people, Moroccans, urging him to return. And one thing led to another, and he wound up moving his family, his two children with him, took his children with him to Tangier, Morocco. And they wound up in Tangier because in Tangier, there was an excellent school for American children to make that transition. And so winding up in North Africa proved life-altering for Randy Weston, and it gave him his foothold on living in Africa.
So he survived by playing gigs in Tangier, or did he go across the water?
No, he actually established a club in Tangier called the African Rhythms Club. That was another thing in his trips to Africa on the State Department tour. He always endeavored to engage with African musicians, and so he was meeting African musicians like Fela and like the guitar player in Nigeria, Bobby Benson, and these musicians. He noticed that they all had home bases. Everyone knows about Fela's famous place, the Shrine. Well, he noticed that these musicians all had a home base. And so he determined that he wanted to have a home base as well. So he established a club called the African Rhythms Club in Tangier, on the second floor above a theater. And he started bringing some of his cohorts from the U.S. and bringing them and collaborating with African musicians. And he started bringing all kinds of Black music to the African Rhythms Club in Tangier. And so that was his base of operations. And he worked from there and did his various tours and recordings, etc., based in Tangier.
So how did you encounter him?
Well, that Randy is someone I had met I had first met Randy in the 1980s. And then in 1998, Randy was part of the Montreal Jazz Festival. He was one of the featured artists at the Montreal Jazz Festival. That particular festival has a program called the Invitation Series. And what that series is about is engaging artists who have more than one band, more than one project, artists who have multiple projects. And so that particular year, 1998, they had two. The Montreal Jazz Festival is probably the biggest in the world. It's huge. And they had two Invitation Series artists, and each of them did 4 nights. And the first Invitation Series artist that year was the tenor saxophonist David Murray. And David Murray did his 4 nights, including one night with the World Saxophone Quartet. And then the culmination of David Murray's 4 nights was a duo concert with Randy Weston, because they had made a duo recording for the Black Saint label. And they did the duo concert, and then the next 4 nights were Randy Weston nights. And so his contributions to that festival was so thrilling, and I was so gratified to have an opportunity to experience that he's someone who rose to the top of my consciousness as far as musicians and whatnot that I needed to further investigate and more deeply investigate. And at the same time, I was engaged to write web content for the National Endowment for the Arts Jazz Masters program. And in writing that web content, the whole idea was to have a bio and also a discography of their recordings, a videography of various video recordings that they had made, and a bibliography of various books by or about them. And I was appalled as I went through these various great masters and discovered that so few of them had books written on them. So few of them, so few biographies, so few autobiographies. And so it was at a certain point where I had decided that I did want to write some books. And, you know, one thing led to another, and I became very friendly with Randy's music director. And I decided to ask him rather than go directly to Randy. I asked him, as his name is a saxophonist name. His professional name is TK Blue. His name is Talib Kibwe. And so Talib and I talked, and I said, Talib, do you think Randy would be interested in having his story told? And he said, wow, he said, it's interesting because he talks about that all the time, but he's never really done anything about it. So Randy and I got together and we decided to collaborate on this book. And it took 10 years, but it was 10 of the greatest years of my life, and a very valuable experience.
Mm-hmm. So who is Farah Jasmine Griffith? And by the way, why are there so few Black women critics and artists in this field?
Well, Gerald, you know, that strikes not just to Black women, but to the whole gender. A shortage of women, period, writing about this music, not just Black women. So, you know, based upon what I said earlier about the shortage of Black writers on the music, period, you can only imagine that as a subset, there are even fewer Black women writing about the music. But Farah Jasmine Griffin, to return to your question, she is a professor at Columbia University, and she has written one of the definitive volumes on Billie Holiday. And so she's someone who I had read down through the years, her various contributions. And so it was essential that she'd be a part of this book. So she was one of the people who was interviewed for Ain't But a Few of Us.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Willard Jenkins, editor of the book Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. What is to be done to make the title of your book anachronistic, so to speak?
What is to be done? Well, you know, one of the things I've been looking at, and that is as a result of my various travels and my interactions, you know, I've become very familiar with the whole phenomenon of jazz education. And jazz education, frankly, jazz education is the strongest sector of the so-called jazz community, because we're seeing all over the world, young people still have a desire to play this music. You know, I think for some of them, they recognize the fact that having the ability to play jazz music and to improvise will provide an outstanding springboard to what may be their aspirations as musicians, beyond jazz, so to speak. But then there are so many who want to play jazz at the core of their music performing interests. And, you know, we all know that not all of these thirsty music students are going to become active performing jazz musicians. But there are other opportunities to participate within this music and to contribute to this music. And one of those opportunities is writing about this music. And so I think that in the jazz education field, there are opportunities to impact young Black aspiring musicians who may not be musicians as professionals, but who may have that great desire to continue their relationship with the music, and that and find that writing about the music is a viable option to continue their relationship with the music. And so I'm hoping that through various interactions and working with educators and working with programs like right here in Washington, D.C., the great jazz program at Howard University, I'm hoping that somewhere along those lines, we can help to impact young Black aspiring writers, or those who may not even recognize that they have that skill, but that we can help to nurture that skill and that interest and build a stronger core of Black writers writing on this music.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Willard Jenkins, editor of the book Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. Check out OpenSkyJazz.com while you're at it. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
And thank you, Gerald Horne. Thank you so much for what you do and what you represent.
Right on.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Willard Jenkins, representing the DC Jazz Music Festival. Get to your favorite Black-owned bookstore and find his book, Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. Thank you to Prison Radio for continuing to provide a platform for those who have had their voices silenced. And shout out to Brother Darren Stanley, aka Knowledge Born God Allah, for sharing his experience with us. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka for giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Baba Didan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thank you to all of you loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Asunta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.